The first question will go to Will. Why should a voter whose number one issue is climate change vote for you instead of your opponent?
So hi everyone, I'm Will Eisenberg. I live in Ward 6, obviously.
Oh, sorry, could you please use the mic?
Use the mic?
It's being recorded.
Of course, yeah. Hi, so I'm Will. I live in Ward 6. So I'll talk a little bit about my environmental background. One of my first jobs was for Environment Massachusetts, writing their direct mail appeals. You'd get the mail, you'd open it up, it says, do you want to spend $5 a month to help the environment? You'd say no, throw it in the trash. I used to write that. After that, I went to the United States Congress. I worked for a member of Congress dealing with the Army Corps of Engineers on large-scale environmental projects. I helped cities get millions of dollars for things like municipal solar panels, get federal grants, things like that. Came back here, started a law firm working with a partner. In March 2018, there was the terrible nor'easter. You know, my family suffered, unfortunately, some pretty significant damage in that storm. We were displaced. Our neighbors were displaced. And in the aftermath, I looked to the City Council for leadership. I reached out to my opponent. Unfortunately, his mailbox was full. Let me tell you exactly what I would have done if I were the city councilor in that instance. I would have knocked on every single door of people who were involved who were hurt by the hurricane. I would have gotten between them and their insurance company to make sure they had what they needed. I would have been a liaison with them with the city. And that's the kind of thing we need to be focusing on, because Ward 6 is particularly vulnerable to these severe weather events. The next storm is going to happen again. It's just a matter of time. We need to be prepared, and we need to have a city councilor who both understands the problem and is willing to solve it. And that's why I think you should vote for me. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. My name's Bill Harris. Of course, thank you to QCAN. It isn't like we don't know each other, right? Because the group met with me. We met at the Kennedy Center. In the following meeting, I put into play the waste testing, the proposal that passed by the City Council. And I think you folks, if I saw on your website, you're meeting on it. Am I correct? I think you folks are meeting on it, right? And that started from me trusting you and you trusting me, and I immediately acted on it. And that's how I've done. Now, if my mailbox was full, we wouldn't have had that meeting. But again, during storms, you get, as a city councilor, you get a lot of calls, and the mailbox gets people who know me, for the most part, I answer the phone all the time. Thank you.
Okay. So next question is, what do you see as the biggest environmental problems affecting your ward and its residents? Which is the top priority for you, and how are you addressing it, or how would you propose to address it?
Sure. Well, one of our biggest, in Ward 6, one of the biggest threats we have right now to the environment is obviously one of the biggest fights that I'm in, and we're in. And that's the Long Island Bridge. Long Island Bridge, if the city of Boston gets their way, can do numerous amount of different types of damage to our environment. One starting with just the process of rebuilding the bridge and the pylons, and bringing up all the years and years and years of things that shouldn't be brought up, because it's just going to affect us. Another thing is, with the Long Island Bridge, is not only to our residents in Ward 6 is noise pollution from vehicles, if they ever got their way, from noise pollution to buses that would obviously, and additional cars that would be astronomical. That would affect my ward and our environment locally. Thank you.
Thank you. So I agree and disagree with my opponent. I agree the Long Island Bridge is a serious issue that needs to be addressed. Fortunately, it's being addressed. The city of Quincy has a lawsuit against the city of Boston. That lawsuit has been allowed to proceed. The Long Island Bridge, fortunately, is going to be tied up in litigation for years. it's not currently the most pressing environmental issue facing our community. The most pressing environmental issue facing our community is flooding and flood mitigation. Now, I've talked to dozens and dozens of people throughout the ward, many of whom say every time it rains, there's a culvert that's filled up, my basement fills up. Again, when that big storm hit, people lost their housing, people lost their cars. What the city needs to be doing in order to make sure that the next time we get a bad storm, people don't lose their homes, is deal with both short-term and long-term flood mitigation proposals. Now, whether that be, setting up deployable flood barriers, as they do in some other cities, or dealing with the city engineer, as they have in Ward 1, to look at improvements to the seawall, that's what we need to be focusing on, because that is a very pressing issue to members of our community.
Thank you. For the next question, we'll start with Will again. Regarding climate preparedness, actually, these were all prepared in advance. Climate Preparedness Week is something that occurs during the last week of September, dedicated to learning, service, and actions that better prepare our communities for extreme weather events, which could include floods, storms, heat waves. Do you believe our city is adequately prepared for climate change now and in the future? Does the city have good plans, and are they communicated well?
No, I don't, and
Microphone, please.
Sorry, I'm used to not using a microphone. No, I don't think that the city has an adequate emergency preparedness. We saw when that last storm hit, and so many of our neighbors were stranded, and the causeway to Squantum was inaccessible. I think that the city has done a pretty good job reacting. DPW comes around, they clean out, they pump out people's basements and things like that, but they're not being proactive. They're not preparing for the next event. They're not strengthening our infrastructure so that we can better weather the storm. Ward 6 has a very high senior population. The next time, a severe weather event occurs, people could be in serious danger. So we need to be preparing not just for the aftermath, but to mitigate. And again, there are various ways to do that, whether it's looking at long-term things like raising some of our roads, raising the seawall, purchasing flood barriers and things like that. That's the sort of emergency preparedness that we need to be undertaking.
As far as the preparedness is concerned, I believe that the city and all of the folks who worked for the city, from whether the fire department, police department, they all rallied together. I believe that they did a good job. Now, as far as Squantum is concerned, I've lived there. I've lived in my community for over 23 years, and so I know what goes on in Squantum as far as a lunar event with a storm hitting. It happens, and it doesn't happen that often, but when it does happen, the city is right there, and our folks here do a great job. I do know that the city has done, especially along the streets in North Quincy, they have just put in piping and repair work, because again, our sewers are old. They weren't made for what we're facing, and I believe that the city is. We're doing roads and sewers and lines all over. Every street is being done. So I think that the city is prepared. Thank you.
Bill, if the city were to electrify its vehicle fleet, which city vehicles would you start with and why? And really, any other comments you'd like to make about electric vehicles?
Well, I think obviously all the management, all the folks that I don't know how the electrical vehicles, as far as the big vehicles are concerned, how they work or how efficient they are. But I think that all of the folks that are driving around checking on jobs, inspectors, that can happen. I know that I saw one of the questions probably ahead is I think the reason why, for instance, the police department hasn't started yet is because they just haven't built the new facility that they're building. So once they build the new facility, I believe they're going to have electric stations put in, and as things are upgraded, you just can't all of a sudden. There's no sense of something like that being put in, and then we're going to tear it down. So that would be just a waste of money. But I believe that 3 years ago, the city council spoke to looking into it, and again, I think it's a work in progress. Thank you.
I would probably, I would look at the largest fleet, which I believe outside of the police department is the DPW fleet, and then I would move to that, and I would move to implement it immediately. Now, the city council, as my opponent said, passed a resolution several years ago, and nothing's been done. And there's a simple reason that nothing's been done. No one's advocated for it. Nobody's, been able to pound the table. And I think, again, mindful of the fact that Ward 6 is the canary in the coal mine. We are particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So we need to be the leader on the city council to make sure that the city does everything it can to mitigate the effects of climate change. The city councilors at large, their mandate is the entire city. The ward councilors should be a zealous advocate for their wards. And that means pounding the table and, yes, standing up to the mayor when things aren't happening fast enough. So I would immediately move to modernize our vehicle fleet and institute hybrid and electric vehicles to the greatest extent possible. And I would hold the mayor accountable for that.
Okay, last question. We'll go to Will. Our city government has decreased our carbon footprint by installing solar panels on the roofs of city buildings, but there's lots more room for additional solar. Would you introduce a city council resolution to ask the mayor to explore solar parking structures, also known as solar canopies, for city-owned parking lots at schools and other government buildings?
Well, not only would I do that, yes, and not only would I do that, I would take it upon myself to find every single federal grant that a municipality can get, and there are quite a few through the Department of Energy, to solarize municipal buildings. I would work with our federal delegation to identify federal money that we can bring into the city to put solar panels on our municipal buildings.
Well, it's pretty simple. I think Chuck Phelan mentioned it earlier. He was part of Quincy High School and how it actually makes money for us. And solar is solar, whether it's solar, wind, I think we have to do whatever it takes. At this point, I think my wife gave me a line earlier tonight. We certainly have to find different ways of doing things, and we really do. I usually listen to my wife most of the time. So thank you, folks. Thank you for coming.
All right, yeah. Thank you both.